I had a slide of Al Capone's cell in the East Pennsylvania prison, but I apparently can't find it. So moving on, it said that Al Capone furnished his cell with antiques, rugs, and oil paintings. This prison closed in 1971 after 142 years of use. It's currently a National Historic Landmark. In colonial America, jail was used temporarily to house people before trial. Punishments were loose, unsystematic, usually requiring fines, banishment, harsh corporal punishments, or death. After the Revolution, with increasing population and industrialization, more was needed. In 1790, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia was converted into a prison where offenders could be incarcerated for their crimes. It was organized according to John Howard's principles of religious teaching, hard work, and discipline. Inmates were housed in solitary cells and had large doses of religious education. Just an aside, it's very interesting to me to see that most inmates I spoke with in California state prisons found religion in prison. Unfortunately, they seem to have lost it upon their release. Later in the 1790s, New York opened Newgate Prison, and the penitentiary movement was born in New York and Pennsylvania, leading the way. The Pennsylvania system, sometimes called the separate system, stayed with the Howard plan of housing inmates in solitary cells in order for them to reflect on their misdeeds. The New York system, or Auburn system, allowed inmates to work and eat together during the day in silence and return to their solitary cells at night. Eventually, the Auburn system was adopted by other states in order to avoid the harmful psychological effects of solitary confinement, and it allowed for inmates to be housed in less space. The cells were only used for sleeping, so they did not need to be as large. As the country was moving from an agrarian society towards an industrial one, the Auburn system allowed for manufacturing to be an option in prisons. By the time of the Civil War, there was serious discontent in the penitentiary system. The method was not deterring crime nor reforming offenders, and more importantly, they weren't profitable. Businesses were opposed to prison manufacturing because prisons could produce goods more cheaply, thereby cutting into profits of open market goods. In 1870, the National Prison Association was started in Cincinnati by Enoch Wines and Zebulon Brockway. They began a new type of institution for younger and less hardened offenders between 16 and 30 years old. It emphasized academic and vocational training with a military-like discipline. Sentences were indeterminate, and release was based on sufficient progress in programs intended to reform inmates so that they could become productive members of society. This system appeared to be more successful than the old system and was based on deterrence, which was based on deterrence alone. Around the same time, the reformatory movement encouraged segregation of women, and the first women's prison was built in Indiana in 1873. Women were trained to fulfill traditional female roles of that time: cooking, sewing, etc. The stereotype of the early 20th century prison was the image of the big house, a walled prison with stacks. This is San Quentin, with stacks of 3 or more tiers of 1 or 2 man cells. The last slide and this slide were of San Quentin. Of the dozen or so prisons I've visited in California, San Quentin most closely fit the description of the big house. San Quentin State Prison has 4 massive cell blocks, each identified housing units at San Quentin. They're all 5 stories high. These prisons were built to house 2,500 men whose labor was exploited. During the arrival, let's see. With the arrival of the Great Depression, the big house became oriented towards custody and repression. Then in the 1940s and 50s, correctional institutions were organized according to the medical model. Crime was seen as a personal illness. Inmates were given psychological assessments and diagnoses. Academic and vocational training and counseling were prevalent at this time. The coercion was much more subtle. If an inmate did not show progress as a result of treatment, parole could be delayed. During the 1960s and 70s, the effectiveness and fairness of coerced prison rehabilitation was challenged. The subtle coercion of the treatment program model was not working to control inmates. Prisons became more violent. Many of the programs were eliminated due to cutbacks in correctional budgets. Gang violence became prevalent along with interracial conflicts. Perhaps it could be said that the unrest in society due to Vietnam War and civil rights protests and demonstrations translated into more violence in prisons. Beginning in the 1980s, society witnessed the largest incarceration boom in history. As a result, alternatives to traditional incarceration, such as probation programs and other diversion programs, began to be introduced. Currently, many states are resorting to private prisons to solve the overcrowding problem. However, there are many problems with privatization. The first is that private prisons only take the least problematic inmates who cost less to house. Lower medical expenses, fewer correctional officers, and less individual housing units. It's been found that private prisons have charged the government for inmates and employees who weren't actually there. Ghost inmates, I guess. The current trend in prisons is the supermax prison. Inmates are in their cells 23 to 24 hours a day. Fluorescent lights are on day and night. They're allowed to leave their cell 4 or 5 times a week for showers and solitary exercise in things that look like dog runs. In 1988 and 1989, California opened 2 of the first and largest modern supermax prisons, Corcoran and Pelican Bay state prisons. Today, California houses more than 3,300 prisoners in supermaxes. Each month, 50 to 100 inmates are released directly onto parole or simply released on the streets. They're given a bus ticket, and so many people who've been in solitary for years and suddenly released. How good an idea is this? Compared to non-supermax prisoners in California, there's a disproportionate number of Latinos who have served long prison sentences under these severe conditions. Many of these incarcerated men have gang-related offenses. When these prisons were designed 20 years ago, it was envisioned that inmates would spend 9 to 18 months in the supermax. Today, the average stay in Pelican Bay is longer than 18 months. As of August 2011, 513 inmates had been held in Pelican Bay for 10 years or more, some more than 20 years. Inmates rarely go directly to supermax prisons. They generally start out in what's called the SHU, S-H-U, Security Housing Units. The SHU is for inmates affiliated with prison gangs or who commit serious disciplinary infractions while in prison. Correctional officers have broad discretion as to who goes to the SHU. Police and correctional officers' discretion is one of those sticky areas where it's a good idea sometimes, and it opens the door to abuse at other times. Empirical research has found evidence that long-term incarceration can cause problems. The environment is very different in prison than what most inmates experience on the outside. Prison experiences do not prepare people for their release. It prepares them to return to prison, where there's some order and where their basic needs are taken care of. The trade-off, of course, is freedom. Besides the problems the inmates have related to long-term incarceration, there are other special problems in correctional institutions. Among them are inmates with HIV/AIDS, inmates with mental health problems, elderly inmates, inmates with disabilities, etc. Older inmates are the fastest growing population in state prisons. Currently, there are 74,000 inmates in state and federal prisons who are 55 years or older. On average, incarcerated people age at a much faster rate than non-incarcerated people. So an inmate who's 55 may seem more like 65 in terms of the medical care they need. The number is double the number in prison just 10 years ago. Incarcerating an elderly inmate can cost 2 to 3 times that of a younger inmate. In Georgia, approximately $8,500 per year is spent on medical costs for elderly inmates compared to $950 for young inmates, and this is probably much higher now as some of these are older statistics. In the United States, at the end of 2011, 1 in every 34 adults in prison was in prison or jail. Prisons have become populated by younger, more violent offenders. The majority of inmates in state and federal prisons are male, 35% white, 35% white, non-Latino, just under 40% are African American, and about 19% are Latino. Nearly 50% of all state prison inmates were sentenced for violent crimes, while 20% were sentenced for nonviolent drug crimes. When the offender arrives at their destination prison, his or her classification will determine the type of educational, vocational, or rehab they qualify for. If prisoners participate in work programs, they're paid a very small wage, which they can use for incidentals such as candy or personal items, or save money or send some of it to their families. Some states require that a percentage of the inmate's pay be contributed to make restitution or be sent to a victim compensation program. If the inmate works in a private prison industry, he or she may earn federal minimum wage. The problem most prisons have is that there are more available workers than there are jobs. One of the common myths about prisons is that they're basically criminal country clubs because the grounds are always so beautifully groomed with flowers and perfectly trimmed shrubbery. But the fact is, inmates perform these duties. Inmates who are busy all day working or being educated are far less trouble than inmates who have a lot of time on their hands. Counseling is one of the programs that most prisons have. Sometimes the quality is good and sometimes not so good. The type of therapy that seems to be most effective is some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy with the addition of meditation or mindfulness training. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches the inmate the connection between thoughts and behaviors, and meditation or similar training teaches the inmate to be more aware of his or her inner states. Inmates who complete this type of program have reduced rates of recidivism. With anger management programs, it's about 27% less, and with educational programs, it's higher, closer to 40% lower rate than inmates who did not participate. The problem is that the public does not think long-term. Critics of prison programs are against coddling inmates, but what they don't realize is that money spent retraining and re-educating inmates costs less than having them enter prison's revolving door with more time in than out. Okay, and I'm going to end there to go to the next let's see, one more. Oh, this is Vacaville State Prison, which has about twice as many inmates as they're supposed to have.